In 988 AD, a man stood at the edge of a river and made a decision that would echo for over 1,000 years. His name was Vladimir. He was the ruler of Kievan Rus, a man history describes as a conqueror, a warrior, a prince who had taken power through force and ruled through fear. He was not the kind of man you would expect to become the father of Christianity in Ukraine, and yet, on that day, he walked into the waters of the Dnieper River, and an entire civilization walked in with him. But here is what makes Ukraine's story unlike almost any other in this series. The gospel didn't arrive here quietly, through a single missionary or a slow cultural shift. It arrived all at once, through a royal decree, a mass baptism, a moment so dramatic and so consequential that it still defines Ukrainian identity today, over 10 centuries later. And then, almost immediately, it was tested by invading armies, by foreign empires, by czars who tried to weaponize it, by a Soviet regime that tried to destroy it completely. The Ukrainian church survived communism, survived occupation, survived everything, and is now being tested again in real time as missiles fall on its cities. What you're about to hear is not just a story about religion. It is a story about identity, about what a people holds on to when everything else is being taken away, about what happens to faith when it is stripped of its buildings, its priests, its Bibles, and forced to survive on nothing but memory and courage. The gospel came to Ukraine more than 1,000 years ago, and every single century since then, someone has tried to take it away. And every single century, it has refused to go. Stay with me, because how the gospel came to Ukraine and what it cost to keep it is a story that deserves to be told in full. 5 chapters, 1,000 years. Let's begin. Vladimir of Kiev was no saint. Far from it. Historical records describe a man who seized power through violence, who warred against his own brothers, who ruled with an iron fist over one of the largest territories in Eastern Europe. This was the man who, in 988 AD, sent emissaries across the known world to study its major religions: Islam, Judaism, Roman Christianity, Byzantine Christianity, like someone comparing options in a marketplace. He wasn't searching for spirituality, he was searching for power. And what he found changed everything. The emissaries who returned from Constantinople brought back a report that stopped Vladimir cold. They described the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the music, the light, the presence of something they could not explain in words. We did not know, they said, whether we were in heaven or on earth. That sentence, recorded in medieval chronicles, is one of the most extraordinary moments in all of Christian history. A brutal warrior decided the spiritual destiny of an entire nation based on the testimony of men who were left speechless by the beauty of a cathedral. And then came the day Vladimir was baptized, and he ordered the people of Kiev to descend into the Dnieper River. Men, women, children, the elderly, all entered the waters together. In a single day, a nation was baptized. Byzantine priests praying in Greek, and an entire people emerging from the water with a new identity, without yet fully understanding what it would mean for the next 1,000 years. The Vladimir of Kiev baptism was not merely a religious event. It was the birth of a civilization. If this story is already pulling you in, hit subscribe. This trail is just beginning. Barely 2 centuries after Vladimir's mass baptism, the Mongols arrived. In 1240, the armies of Batu Khan swept through Kievan Rus like a storm that left almost nothing standing. Kiev, the city of golden-domed churches and Byzantine mosaics, was reduced to rubble. The political structure that Vladimir had built was gone. And yet, the faith he had planted survived. Hidden in monasteries tucked into hillsides, carried by monks who fled into forests, preserved in the memory of a people who had lost everything except what they believed. What followed over the next several centuries was a relentless tug-of-war over the soul of Ukraine. Polish Catholic kings pressed from the west. Russian Orthodox czars pressed from the east. And caught in the middle was a people that refused to be fully swallowed by either side. Out of that impossible tension was born something unique: the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. A church that kept the ancient Byzantine liturgy, but maintained its connection to Rome. It was neither fully east nor fully west. It was unmistakably, stubbornly Ukrainian. This matters more than it might seem, because what the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church represented was not just a theological compromise, it was an act of resistance. A community saying, "We will not be erased by you, or by you, or by you." That spirit, that fierce, creative, defiant insistence on a distinct Ukrainian spiritual identity, would become the foundation that later generations stood on when the darkest chapter of all arrived. And the darkest chapter was coming. Its name was Stalin. In the 1930s, Stalin looked at Ukraine and saw a problem. The Ukrainian church represented something that a totalitarian state simply cannot tolerate: a loyalty that goes beyond the state itself, an authority higher than the party, a community of people who gathered regularly, who shared a story that predated communism by 1,000 years, and who drew their deepest identity not from Moscow, but from something Moscow could not control. And so Stalin did what totalitarian leaders always do. He tried to destroy it. What followed was one of the most systematic campaigns against Christianity in modern history. Thousands of churches were closed, padlocked, repurposed as warehouses, or simply demolished. Priests and bishops were arrested, sent to labor camps, or executed. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was officially banned in 1946 and forcibly merged into the Russian Orthodox Church. Seminaries shut down, Bibles were confiscated. Public worship became an act of courage that could cost you everything. And yet, the faith did not die. It went underground, into kitchens and basements, into forests where small groups gathered in secret, into the hands of grandmothers who became, without any official title, the true guardians of the faith. These women, known in Ukrainian as babusi, memorized prayers, taught the Lord's Prayer to their grandchildren in whispers, kept icons hidden behind cupboards. They were the Ukrainian church survived communism. Not the institutions, not the bishops, but the grandmothers. There is a story that captures this era perfectly. A young boy growing up in Soviet Ukraine asks his grandmother why she prays to someone he has never heard of at school. She pulls him close, looks toward the door to make sure no one is listening, and begins to tell him about Jesus, about the resurrection, about a hope that no government decree could touch. That boy grows up. The Soviet Union eventually falls. And on the first Sunday that churches reopen freely across Ukraine, he is there, because a grandmother's whisper had never left him. That is how Christianity in Ukraine survived the 20th century. not through power, through love passed quietly from one generation to the next. It is 1991. The Soviet Union has just collapsed, and across Ukraine, something extraordinary is happening. Church doors that had been padlocked for decades are being pushed open, some for the first time in 50 years. Old women are bringing icons out from behind cupboards into the light. Men who had never once set foot in a church are walking through those doors for the first time, unsure of what to do, but knowing with every fiber of their being that they belong there. 50 years of silence. And then, a bell. A real bell, ringing freely with nothing to fear. What happened to Christianity in Ukraine after 1991 was not a slow revival. It was an eruption. Churches that reopened with a handful of worshipers were overflowing within months. Bibles were being printed and distributed by the millions. Seminaries reopened. The faith that had been compressed underground for 50 years hadn't weakened at all. It had only intensified. And when the pressure was finally released, it came rushing to the surface with a force that surprised everyone, including the Ukrainians themselves. That tension between a faith deeply rooted in history and a people fiercely asserting its independence would define Ukrainian Christianity for the next 3 decades. And then, just when it seemed like the dust was beginning to settle, in February 2022, Russian tanks crossed the border. Cities that had celebrated the rebirth of faith 30 years earlier were now under bombardment. And the question that had been simmering for decades: what does it mean to be Ukrainian? And what does the gospel have to do with it? Suddenly became the most urgent question in the country. On February 24th, 2022, Ukraine woke up to the sound of explosions. Russian missiles struck cities across the country in the early hours of the morning. Within days, millions of Ukrainians were fleeing their homes. And in the middle of all of it, in a detail that the international news cameras kept capturing almost by accident, the churches were full. Not empty, not abandoned, full. As if the people of Ukraine had instinctively known exactly where to go when the world fell apart around them. What happened inside those churches is one of the most remarkable untold stories of this war. Pastors found themselves counseling families who had lost everything overnight. Church buildings became literal sanctuaries, sheltering displaced families, distributing food and medicine, organizing evacuations. In the basement of one Kiev church, a congregation held its Sunday service while air raid sirens wailed above them, singing hymns in the dark, praying with an urgency that no peacetime sermon could ever manufacture. Faith in Ukraine war was not an abstract concept. It was people choosing to worship God with missiles in the air. And then there were the chaplains, men and women of faith who refused to stay behind the front line, holding communion in trenches, praying with wounded soldiers in field hospitals, sitting with men in their final moments and reminding them that they were not alone. And perhaps the most powerful dimension of all, when Russia justified its invasion partly on the grounds of shared Orthodox heritage, the Ukrainian church responded with clarity that shocked even seasoned observers. Ukrainian Christians of every denomination found themselves united by something older and deeper than theology. The conviction that their faith, their land, and their identity were inseparable. We have walked through 5 chapters of one of the most extraordinary stories in all of Christian history. We saw a warrior prince step into a rivers and baptize an entire civilization in a single day. We saw that faith survive Mongol invasions, Polish pressure, and Russian czars. We saw Stalin close the churches and drive the gospel underground, only to watch it survive in the whispers of grandmothers who refused to let it die. And then we saw the resurrection, church doors swinging open after 50 years of silence, bells ringing freely for the first time in living memory, a people rushing back to something that had never truly left them. Because faith that is compressed underground doesn't disappear. It concentrates. And when it finally surfaces, it surfaces with a force that nothing built by human hands can contain. And now, today, that same faith is being tested again. In bomb shelters and trenches, in field hospitals and ruined cities, in congregations that sing hymns while air raid sirens sound above them. Faith in Ukraine war is not a metaphor. It is men and women choosing, in the most desperate circumstances imaginable, to believe that the story is not over. That the last word does not belong to the missiles. That the gospel that arrived in the waters of the Dnieper over 1,000 years ago is still worth everything it costs. If this story moved you, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear this story today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because every country in this series carries a story just like this one. A story of faith arriving in impossible circumstances and refusing, no matter the cost, to be extinguished. The trail doesn't end here. Subscribe, share this story, and we'll see you in the next episode.